A Ravens player walked through the front door of a billionaire's mansion on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. He sat down in the living room, looked the owner directly in the eyes, and started talking. What came out of his mouth over the next hour would end an 18-year dynasty. This wasn't a casual visit. This wasn't a friendly check-in. This was a player so frustrated, so convinced that something was broken inside the Baltimore Ravens organization, that he bypassed every chain of command and went straight to the man who signs the checks. And he wasn't alone. Throughout that same day, multiple players shared their own concerns with owner Steve Bisciotti. By the time the sun set over Baltimore, the fate of John Harbaugh was sealed. The headlines will tell you this was about a missed field goal. They'll tell you it was about playoff failures and disappointing seasons. But that's not the real story. The real story involves secret meetings, a quarterback caught in the middle, a coordinator nobody could agree on, and an owner who chose the future over 18 years of friendship. What actually happened behind closed doors in Baltimore is far more explosive than anyone has revealed. Until now. To understand why Steve Bisciotti pulled the trigger on John Harbaugh, you first need to understand who Steve Bisciotti really is. This isn't your typical NFL owner. He didn't inherit his fortune from daddy. He didn't stumble into wealth through lucky investments or family connections. Steve Bisciotti built everything from nothing, and that origin story shapes every single decision he makes. Back in 1983, a 23-year-old Bisciotti and his cousin Jim Davis scraped together enough money to start a small staffing company called Aerotech. They operated out of a cramped basement office with second-hand furniture and outdated equipment. Nobody gave them a chance. Nobody thought two young guys from Baltimore could compete with established staffing giants. But Bisciotti had something most people don't. He had an almost supernatural ability to read situations, evaluate talent, and most importantly, know exactly when it was time to make a change. That basement startup eventually became the Allegiz Group, one of the largest talent management firms on the planet. Bisciotti's net worth climbed into the billions. And when he purchased a majority stake in the Baltimore Ravens in 2000, then took over full ownership in 2004, he brought that same ruthless business mentality with him. Here's what most people don't realize about Bisciotti. He listens. Not in the performative way most executives listen, nodding along while already having made up their minds. Bisciotti genuinely seeks input from the people inside his organization. He wants to know what's working and what isn't. Asks questions. He takes notes, and when enough voices tell him the same thing, he acts without hesitation. We saw this play out back in December 2007. The Ravens had just finished a disastrous 5-11 season under head coach Brian Billick. Now, Billick wasn't some random coach. This was the man who had delivered Baltimore its first Super Bowl championship just 7 years earlier. He was a legend. He had 3 years and $15 million remaining on his contract. Most owners would have given him another chance. Most owners would have been too scared to fire a Super Bowl winner. Bisciotti fired him anyway. When asked about that decision years later, Bisciotti admitted something fascinating. He said player feedback was instrumental in that firing. He had talked to his team. He had listened to what they were saying about their coach. And when enough players expressed concerns, Bisciotti trusted their judgment over his own loyalty to Billick. That's an incredibly rare quality in an NFL owner. Most billionaires surround themselves with yes men who tell them exactly what they want to hear. Bisciotti actively seeks out the uncomfortable truths. He wants to know when something is broken, even if fixing it means making a painful decision. This philosophy has defined his entire ownership tenure. Bisciotti doesn't believe in waiting to see if problems magically resolve themselves. He doesn't believe in giving coaches extra chances when the evidence suggests they've lost the locker room. He believes in gathering information, processing it quickly, and making decisive moves before situations spiral out of control. Some people call this approach cold. Others call it brilliant. The results speak for themselves. Under Bisciotti's ownership, the Ravens have been one of the most consistently competitive franchises in professional football. They've made the playoffs more times than almost anyone. They've developed 2 different MVP quarterbacks. They've built a reputation as a first-class organization that players actually want to join. But that success comes with a dark side. When Bisciotti decides it's time to move on, he moves on completely. There's no sentimentality. There's no second guessing. There's just the cold calculation that change is necessary, followed by immediate action. The football world was about to witness this philosophy in its most dramatic form. Because in January 2026, Steve Bisciotti found himself in an eerily familiar position. His team had just finished another disappointing season. His coach, once again, had years remaining on his contract. And once again, Bisciotti was hearing things from his players that he couldn't ignore. The parallels to 2007 were almost too perfect. A Super Bowl-winning coach who had overstayed his welcome. A roster that had mentally checked out. An owner caught between loyalty and ambition. History wasn't just rhyming. It was repeating itself word for word. But there was one crucial difference this time. In 2007, Bisciotti fired a coach he respected professionally, but wasn't particularly close to personally. In 2026, he would have to fire someone he genuinely considered a friend. Someone he had stood beside through championships and heartbreaks. Someone who had given 18 years of his life to the Baltimore Ravens organization. That made what was about to happen so much more devastating. And what happened next would catch everyone, including John Harbaugh himself, completely off guard. Monday, January 6, 2026, the day after Tyler Luke's missed field goal ended the Ravens' season against the Bills. John Harbaugh woke up that morning knowing he had a big meeting ahead. The season was over. Evaluations were coming. But after 18 years, Harbaugh knew the drill. He'd been through this process more times than he could count. He drove to the Ravens facility with a clear head. Yes, the season had been disappointing. Yes, there were problems that needed addressing. But Harbaugh had weathered worse storms than this. He'd survived losing seasons. He'd survived quarterback controversies. He'd survived media criticism and fan frustration and everything else the NFL throws at its coaches. This was just another bump in the road. Waiting for him in that meeting room were three familiar faces. General Manager Eric DeCosta, a man Harbaugh had worked alongside for nearly 2 decades. Executive Vice President Ozzie Newsome, the legendary architect of the Ravens' most successful era. And Team President Sashi Brown, the newest member of the leadership group. These were Harbaugh's colleagues, his partners in building something special. Notably absent was Steve Bisciotti. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Bisciotti didn't attend every meeting. He trusted his front office to handle certain conversations. There was nothing unusual about the owner delegating initial discussions to his executives, or so Harbaugh thought. The meeting lasted for hours. They discussed the season's failures in detail. The 1-5 start that put them in an impossible hole. The blown fourth quarter leads. The inconsistent performances at home, where the Ravens finished 3-6, the worst home record in franchise history. They talked about what went wrong and what needed to change. Harbaugh came prepared with his own vision for fixing the problems. He talked about potential adjustments to the offensive system. He discussed personnel changes that could strengthen the roster. He presented a roadmap for getting back to championship contention. This was vintage Harbaugh. Confident, prepared, forward-thinking. According to sources inside the building, the mood of the meeting was described as unsettled but not alarming. There was tension in the air, certainly. Everyone knew the season hadn't met expectations. But the general sense was that momentum pointed toward Harbaugh returning for year 19. The question wasn't whether he'd be back. The question was what changes he'd have to make to his coaching staff. Maybe offensive coordinator Todd Monken would need to go. Maybe some position coaches would be replaced. These kinds of staff shakeups happen all the time after disappointing seasons. It's a normal part of the NFL cycle. Coaches make sacrifices to save their jobs. Coordinators become scapegoats. Life goes on. Harbaugh left that meeting believing exactly this. He drove home thinking the worst-case scenario was having to fire some assistants he didn't want to fire. Uncomfortable, sure. Painful, perhaps. But nothing he couldn't handle. He'd navigated front office pressure before. He'd made difficult staffing decisions in the past. This was just the cost of doing business in professional football. That night, John Harbaugh probably slept better than he should have. He had no idea what Steve Bisciotti was planning. He had no idea that while he sat in that meeting room presenting his vision for the future, the ground beneath him was already crumbling. Because here's what Harbaugh didn't know. While he was meeting with the front office on Monday, Steve Bisciotti was already making phone calls. The owner wasn't waiting for official evaluations or formal processes. He was conducting his own investigation. He was reaching out directly to players. He was asking questions that had nothing to do with strategy or roster construction. He was asking about John Harbaugh. The people closest to Harbaugh would later describe the days after that Monday meeting as a strange calm before an unexpected storm. Everything seemed normal. The usual end-of-season routines were playing out as expected. There were no warning signs, no hints that something seismic was about to happen. That's what made what came next so shocking. John Harbaugh had been in Baltimore for 18 years. He'd won 180 regular season games, more than almost any active coach in the league. He delivered a Super Bowl championship. He'd built one of the most respected programs in professional football. He had every reason to believe his job was secure. But Steve Bisciotti wasn't evaluating John Harbaugh's resume. He wasn't looking at win-loss records or championship rings. He was listening to voices that Harbaugh couldn't hear. He was gathering information that Harbaugh didn't know existed. And those voices were telling Bisciotti something that would change everything. By the time Tuesday morning arrived, John Harbaugh's fate was essentially sealed. He just didn't know it yet. He was going about his normal routine, making plans for the offseason, thinking about how to improve the team for next year. Meanwhile, across town, a parade of players was about to tell Steve Bisciotti exactly why that future would never include John Harbaugh. The intervention had begun. Tuesday morning, Steve Bisciotti's mansion on the Severn River, one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in Maryland. This is where the billionaire owner of the Baltimore Ravens lives. And on this particular Tuesday, it became the site of the most consequential meetings in franchise history. The first player arrived sometime in the early afternoon. He walked through Bisciotti's front door, was escorted to the living room, and sat down for what sources describe as an extensive, in-depth conversation. This wasn't a quick phone call. This wasn't a casual check-in. This was a player who felt strongly enough about the state of the organization that he drove to his owner's home for a face-to-face meeting. Think about what that means for a second. NFL players don't typically show up at their owner's house uninvited. There are protocols. There are chains of command. You talk to your position coach, who talks to the coordinator, who talks to the head coach, who talks to the general manager. That's how things work. You don't bypass the entire system and go straight to the guy at the top. Unless you believe the situation has become absolutely critical. Unless you've lost faith in the normal channels. Unless you're convinced that the only way to fix what's broken is to speak directly to the person who has the power to change everything. That's exactly what happened on that Tuesday afternoon. And it wasn't just one player. Throughout the day, Bisciotti conducted a series of conversations with multiple Ravens players. Some came to his house. Others spoke with him by phone. But the message they delivered was consistent enough that it couldn't be ignored. According to sources who spoke with The Athletic, ESPN, and other outlets, the feedback Bisciotti received was damning. Player after player told him the same thing. John Harbaugh's message had grown stale. His coaching style, once motivating and effective, wasn't connecting with the current roster. His meetings had become repetitive and sometimes contradictory. Younger players and star players felt disconnected from his approach. One player reportedly told investigators that Harbaugh's messages rubbed some people the wrong way. Another source described feeling like the coach wasn't adapting to the current generation of NFL players. These weren't fringe complaints from disgruntled backups. These were concerns raised by core members of the team. Let's be clear about something here. Rumors suggest these conversations painted a picture of a coach who had lost touch with his locker room. Reports claim that players felt Harbaugh's demanding old-school approach no longer resonated with a roster that looked nothing like the teams he'd coached earlier in his tenure. It's been said that the culture Harbaugh had built over 18 years had slowly eroded as veteran leaders retired and younger players took their place. Whether all of these claims are completely accurate is impossible to know for certain. We're dealing with anonymous sources and second-hand accounts. But what is certain is that Steve Bisciotti heard enough to convince him that something was fundamentally broken. Here's what made these player conversations so devastating. For over a decade, the Ravens roster had been built in Harbaugh's image. The team specifically sought out players who would buy into his demanding philosophy. Veterans like Ray Lewis, Terrell Suggs, and Ed Reed served as his torchbearers, enforcing standards and preaching the Harbaugh gospel to younger teammates. But that generation of Ravens was gone. The roster had turned over almost completely. And the new generation of players, particularly the younger stars who would determine the franchise's future, weren't responding to Harbaugh's message the way previous teams had. This is a problem that eventually catches up to almost every long-tenured coach. The NFL changes. Players change. What worked 10 years ago doesn't necessarily work today. The coaches who survive the longest are the ones who adapt their approach to fit their personnel. And according to what Bisciotti was hearing, John Harbaugh had stopped adapting. The irony is that Harbaugh was famous for his energy and enthusiasm. He prowled the sidelines like a man possessed. He gave passionate speeches. He demanded excellence from everyone around him. That intensity had fueled the Ravens' championship run and sustained the franchise through years of competitive football. But intensity can become exhausting when it never changes. Passion can feel performative when the results don't match the hype. And demanding excellence rings hollow when the team keeps falling short in crucial moments. At least, that's what reports suggest players were feeling. By the time the last player left Bisciotti's presence on Tuesday, the owner had heard more than enough. The picture was clear. His locker room wasn't just disappointed with the season. They were disappointed with the coach. And if Bisciotti had learned anything from his decades in business, it was that you can't build a championship team when your players have lost faith in their leader. But the player feedback, as damaging as it was, wasn't the final nail in John Harbaugh's coffin. That honor belonged to a different conflict entirely. A standoff between coach and owner that made the decision unavoidable. There was one name that kept coming up in Bisciotti's conversations with players. One person who had become a lightning rod for frustration within the organization. Offensive coordinator Todd Monken. To understand why Monken became so central to this story, you need to understand what happened to the Ravens' offense over the past 2 seasons. In 2024, under Monken's system, Lamar Jackson put together one of the greatest seasons in NFL history. He won his second MVP award. The offense was virtually unstoppable. Everything clicked in perfect harmony. Then 2025 happened, and nothing worked the same way. Sources indicate that the relationship between Lamar Jackson and Todd Monken deteriorated significantly throughout the season. Monken's hard-driving coaching style, which had produced incredible results the year before, suddenly wasn't meshing with Jackson's personality. There was confusion almost every week about whether Jackson would practice due to his various injuries. Communication between quarterback and coordinator became strained and inconsistent. Reports claim that Jackson grew increasingly frustrated with how the offense was being managed. Whether this frustration was justified or simply the result of a difficult season is open to interpretation. But what's clear is that the dynamic between the two most important people on the Ravens' offense had soured. And here's where things get really interesting. According to sources who spoke with Outkick and other outlets, Steve Bisciotti wanted John Harbaugh to fire Todd Monken. The owner believed that finding a new offensive coordinator could unleash Lamar Jackson to return to his MVP form. It wasn't an unreasonable request. Coordinators get replaced all the time in the NFL. It's a normal part of how teams operate. But John Harbaugh refused. Harbaugh stood by his offensive coordinator. He defended Monken. He defended the system that had produced a historically great offense just 1 year earlier. According to reports, Harbaugh argued that the offensive struggles weren't Monken's fault. He reportedly suggested that Jackson needed to do a better job taking care of his body rather than blaming the coaching staff. This created an impossible situation for Steve Bisciotti. On one side, he had his franchise quarterback, a 28-year-old, 2-time MVP signed through 2028 with a massive cap hit, the most important player on the roster, the face of the franchise. And that player was expressing frustration with his offensive coordinator. On the other side, he had his head coach, a 63-year-old with 18 years of service to the organization, a Super Bowl champion, a man who had earned the right to make his own staffing decisions. And that coach was refusing to fire the coordinator his quarterback wanted gone. Something had to give. Bisciotti found himself caught between two people he valued enormously. His franchise's past was represented by Harbaugh. His franchise's present and future was represented by Jackson. They couldn't both get what they wanted. And Bisciotti was the only person with the power to break the tie. The calculus wasn't complicated. Lamar Jackson is 28 years old. He'll be playing quarterback at a high level for the next decade. John Harbaugh is 63. Even if everything went perfectly, he probably had 5 or 6 years left as a head coach. The math pointed clearly in one direction, but it was more than just age. Bisciotti had spent enormous resources securing Lamar Jackson's future with the franchise. That contract represented a commitment to building around Jackson for years to come. If the quarterback was unhappy, if he felt like the organization wasn't listening to his concerns, how long before that unhappiness turned into something more serious? We've seen superstar quarterbacks force their way out of organizations before. We've seen teams lose franchise players because ownership refused to make necessary changes. Bisciotti wasn't going to let that happen, not on his watch. So when Harbaugh dug in his heels on Monken, he essentially forced Bisciotti's hand. The owner wanted a compromise. He wanted his coach to make a relatively minor sacrifice to keep the peace. Instead, Harbaugh chose loyalty to his coordinator over flexibility with his owner. It's actually admirable in a way. Harbaugh wasn't going to throw Monken under the bus to save his own job. He believed in his staff. He defended his people. Those are qualities you want in a leader. But in this particular situation, that loyalty came at an enormous cost. Sources say Harbaugh was so confident in Monken that he planned to bring the coordinator with him to his next job. That tells you everything about where Harbaugh's priorities were. He saw Monken as an asset worth fighting for, even if that fight put his own position in jeopardy. Bisciotti saw things differently. He saw a coach who was prioritizing his assistant over his franchise quarterback. He saw stubbornness where he needed flexibility. He saw a man who refused to acknowledge that change was necessary. And once Bisciotti reached that conclusion, there was no going back. The decision was made. The only question now was how to deliver the news. What happened next would shock everyone. Tuesday afternoon. John Harbaugh finished up his work at the Ravens facility and headed home. It had been a long few days since the playoff loss. Meetings, evaluations, difficult conversations about the future. But that was behind him now. He was driving home, probably thinking about dinner, maybe thinking about the offseason ahead. His phone rang. The caller ID showed Steve Bisciotti. Harbaugh answered. And in that moment, 18 years of history came crashing to an end. According to multiple sources, Bisciotti informed Harbaugh during that phone call that his services were no longer needed. After 180 regular season wins, 13 playoff victories, and a Super Bowl championship, John Harbaugh was fired. Not in a face-to-face meeting. Not in the office where they had celebrated triumphs and weathered disasters together. Over the phone. While Harbaugh's car rolled down a Baltimore County road. Let that sink in for a moment. 18 years of loyalty. 18 years of representing the organization with class and integrity. 18 years of building a culture that made the Ravens one of the most respected franchises in professional sports. And it ended with a voice on the phone delivering the worst news of his professional life. There was no final handshake. No opportunity to look Bisciotti in the eyes and hear the explanation directly. No chance to process the moment in private before facing the world. Just a phone call during his commute home, followed by the realization that everything he'd built was suddenly over. Within minutes of that call ending, the news started to spread. General Manager Eric DeCosta gathered Harbaugh's coaching staff at the facility. According to one assistant who witnessed the moment, DeCosta fought back tears as he informed them that their head coach had been relieved of his duties. DeCosta and Harbaugh weren't just colleagues. They were neighbors. They had lived next door to each other for years. Their families were close. They had shared holidays and barbecues and all the ordinary moments that turn professional relationships into genuine friendships. And now DeCosta was standing in front of Harbaugh's staff, barely able to hold himself together, delivering news that had blindsided everyone. At 5:50 p.m., Ravens players joined a virtual call with DeCosta. He told them it was a hard day for everybody. But by then, most players had already found out through other channels. Social media was exploding. Text messages were flying between players and agents. The story was everywhere. There was no carefully orchestrated announcement. No team meeting where Bisciotti could explain his reasoning directly to the roster. No chance for Harbaugh to say goodbye to the players he had coached for nearly 2 decades. Just chaos and confusion as the news leaked and spread like wildfire across the sports world. The reaction was swift and brutal. NFL fans across social media called the manner of the firing cold-blooded, cruel, disrespectful, and absolutely a clown show. One fan wrote that a person doesn't end an 18-year relationship with a phone call unless they have no respect for the other person. Another added that after almost 20 years, Harbaugh deserved much better than what he got. Even people who agreed with the decision questioned how it was handled. You can fire a coach and still treat him with dignity. You can end a relationship professionally without being cold about it. Bisciotti had chosen the most abrupt, impersonal method possible to deliver life-changing news to a man who had given nearly 2 decades to his organization. It wasn't until Thursday, 2 full days after that phone call, that Bisciotti and Harbaugh spoke again in depth. By then, the initial shock had worn off. Bisciotti wanted to provide further explanation of his decision. He wanted to express his personal feelings about a man he still considered a friend. But the damage was already done. The story of how Harbaugh learned about his firing had become the story. The phone call overshadowed everything else. Instead of focusing on whether the decision was right or wrong, everyone was talking about how disrespectfully it had been handled. Some sources close to Bisciotti have suggested that the phone call wasn't intentionally cold. They say the situation moved quickly, and Bisciotti wanted Harbaugh to hear the news directly from him rather than through media leaks. It was meant as a courtesy, not an insult. But intentions don't matter when the execution is this poor. Bisciotti had 2 full days between the Monday meeting and the Tuesday firing. He could have scheduled a face-to-face conversation. He could have asked Harbaugh to come to his office or his home. He could have treated the end of their 18-year partnership with the gravity it deserved. Instead, he made a phone call while Harbaugh was driving. Whether this was thoughtlessness or callousness, the result was the same. John Harbaugh learned that his career in Baltimore was over in the most impersonal way possible, and the football world took notice. The fallout from that phone call would define the next several days, and it raised questions that Steve Bisciotti would eventually have to answer. The hours after Harbaugh's firing were absolute chaos. Social media exploded with reactions from fans, former players, and media personalities. Almost everyone had an opinion, and almost none of those opinions were kind to Steve Bisciotti. The manner of the dismissal dominated every conversation. People who might have understood the football logic behind the move were instead focused on the phone call. How do you fire someone over the phone after 18 years? How do you end a partnership like that without even looking the person in the eyes? What kind of owner treats a loyal employee that way? Former NFL players weighed in with their own criticisms. Some called it a disgrace to the profession. Others said it showed what owners really think of coaches, that at the end of the day, they're just employees who can be discarded without a second thought. The criticism wasn't limited to fans with no stake in the situation. People inside the football world were genuinely shocked by how it had been handled. The contrast with Harbaugh's behavior made Bisciotti look even worse. Throughout his 18 years in Baltimore, Harbaugh had represented the organization with nothing but class and professionalism. He never publicly criticized ownership. He never threw players under the bus. He never made excuses or pointed fingers when things went wrong. He was the model of what a franchise coach should be. And this was his reward: a phone call during his drive home. Bisciotti's silence in the immediate aftermath only added fuel to the fire. He didn't release a statement explaining his reasoning for hours. He didn't appear publicly to take questions from the media. He let the story spin out of control while people filled the vacuum with their own interpretations. When Bisciotti finally did release a statement, it tried to thread a difficult needle. He acknowledged that this was an incredibly difficult decision. He expressed profound respect for Harbaugh as a coach and as a man of integrity. He mentioned the tremendous 18 years they had spent together, but then he pivoted to what really mattered to him: the championship, the goal that had always been and would always be winning championships. The implicit message was clear. John Harbaugh wasn't going to get them another ring, so they were moving on. To fans still processing the phone call, this explanation fell flat. Yes, winning matters. Yes, championships are the ultimate goal. But does that justify treating a franchise legend like he's disposable? Does the pursuit of a trophy excuse abandoning basic professional courtesy? The Thursday conversation between Bisciotti and Harbaugh was supposed to provide closure. By then, both men had time to process what had happened. Bisciotti reportedly wanted to explain his thinking more fully. He wanted Harbaugh to understand that this wasn't personal, that it was purely about football. But by Thursday, the narrative was already set. Every story about the firing mentioned the phone call. Every analysis of the decision included a paragraph about how poorly it had been handled. Bisciotti's attempt at explanation came too late to change the public perception. The strangest part of the fallout was watching people who supported the decision still criticize how it happened. You could find plenty of Ravens fans who thought Harbaugh's time had come. They pointed to the playoff failures. They mentioned the disconnect with younger players. They argued that 13 years without a Super Bowl was too long to wait for change. But even those fans acknowledged that the execution was terrible. Fire him if you have to, they said, but do it with some class. Give the man a proper goodbye. Let him walk out with dignity after everything he did for the franchise. The damage to Bisciotti's reputation was immediate and significant. For years, he had been considered one of the better owners in professional sports. He stayed out of the spotlight. He let his football people make football decisions. He treated his employees with respect. That image took a serious hit. Some wondered if this would affect the Ravens' coaching search. Would top candidates be hesitant to work for an owner who fires people over the phone? Would potential coaches see how Harbaugh was treated and think twice about trusting Bisciotti with their careers? Others pointed out that NFL coaches are desperate for jobs. No matter how the previous coach was fired, there would be plenty of candidates lining up for the opportunity. The Ravens were still an attractive destination with a franchise quarterback and a solid roster. A few days of bad press wouldn't scare away serious candidates, but the questions lingered. What kind of organization was this really? What did the phone call reveal about how Bisciotti viewed the people who worked for him? And if he could treat a Super Bowl winning coach this way, how would he treat anyone else? These were the questions Steve Bisciotti would have to answer when he finally faced the media. And the answers would determine whether the Ravens could move forward from this mess. So what's the actual truth behind John Harbaugh's firing? After all the noise and controversy about the phone call, what were the real factors that led Steve Bisciotti to end an 18-year partnership? According to sources close to the situation, it wasn't any single thing. It was a perfect storm of circumstances that convinced the owner his franchise needed a completely new direction. The first factor was obvious. On-field performance had declined to unacceptable levels. The Ravens blew a 15-point fourth-quarter lead to Buffalo in their very first game of the season. They started 1-5, matching the worst start in franchise history. They got embarrassed at home repeatedly, finishing 3-6 at their own stadium, the worst home record the franchise had ever produced. The playoff failures had also piled up over the years. The Ravens hadn't won back-to-back playoff games in a single season since their Super Bowl run after the 2012 campaign. That's 13 years of falling short when it mattered most. Tyler Luke's missed field goal wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the latest in a long pattern of execution failures in crucial moments. The second factor was the cultural disconnect that multiple sources described. Bisciotti had heard from players that Harbaugh's program wasn't connecting with the current roster. Sports Illustrated reported that ownership questioned how well Harbaugh fit with the team he was coaching. For over a decade, the Ravens had specifically built their roster in Harbaugh's image. They sought out players who would buy into his demanding philosophy. Veterans served as torchbearers, enforcing standards and keeping younger players in line. But that generation was gone. The roster had turned over completely, and the new players weren't responding to Harbaugh's approach the way previous teams had. The third factor was arguably the most significant. The Lamar Jackson situation had reached a critical point. Whether you believe Jackson actively campaigned for Harbaugh's removal or simply expressed frustration with the offensive setup, the reality was clear. Bisciotti prioritized his franchise quarterback's happiness over his head coach's tenure. Multiple sources expressed surprise at the apparent tension between Harbaugh and Jackson. Nobody in the organization had defended and praised Jackson more consistently than Harbaugh. The coach had always been Jackson's biggest advocate. But perception had become reality, and Bisciotti believed Jackson's best chance to reach his full potential required a new voice leading the team. The fourth factor might be the most damning: John Harbaugh's refusal to adapt. When Bisciotti wanted Monken gone, Harbaugh refused. When players expressed concerns about his approach, Harbaugh defended his methods. A source told reporters that the organization felt a number of things needed to be fixed, and Bisciotti no longer believed Harbaugh was the right person to fix them. Here's what makes this so painful. Bisciotti didn't just fire a coach. He fired a longtime friend. These two men had spent 18 years building something together. They had celebrated a Super Bowl championship. They had weathered losing seasons and quarterback controversies and everything else the NFL throws at franchises. They had negotiated contract extensions and made countless decisions side by side. And now Bisciotti was saying that friendship wasn't enough. The relationship wasn't enough. 18 years of loyalty and partnership wasn't enough. Winning championships mattered more than all of it. Is that fair? That's the question that will be debated for years. On one hand, John Harbaugh is the 14th winningest coach in NFL history. He had only 3 losing seasons in 18 years. He took the Ravens to 12 playoffs. He delivered a championship. He represented the organization with class every single day. On the other hand, the NFL is a what have you done for me lately business. 13 years without a Super Bowl is an eternity in professional football. The failures in big moments had accumulated. And if your franchise quarterback and key players are telling you they need a change, can you really afford to ignore them? Bisciotti clearly decided he couldn't wait and see. Just like with Brian Billick in 2007, he listened to his players, assessed the situation, and made the painful decision to move on from a coach he personally valued. In his statement, Bisciotti said the decision came after a comprehensive evaluation of the season and the overall direction of the organization. He said their goal has always been and will always be to win championships. Steve Bisciotti made a massive gamble when he fired John Harbaugh. He knows it. He acknowledged as much back in 2007 when he said he could end up going through multiple coaches trying to solve the puzzle. Within 45 minutes of being fired, Harbaugh's agent received calls from 7 NFL teams expressing interest. The Giants, Dolphins, Raiders, Titans, and Browns all want him. The man Bisciotti just discarded will almost certainly be coaching a better situation next season. Meanwhile, whoever takes the Ravens' job inherits enormous pressure. A franchise quarterback with influence, the shadow of a man who won 180 games, the expectations of fans who have now watched their owner fire 2 Super Bowl-winning coaches. Bisciotti's legacy depends entirely on whether this decision pays off. If the next coach wins a championship, he's a genius. If they struggle, he's the owner who threw away 18 years of loyalty for nothing. One thing is certain. The NFL just watched Steve Bisciotti choose the future over the past in the coldest way possible. And now everyone is waiting to see if that choice was worth destroying a dynasty to make. John Harbaugh wasn't getting us another ring, so we're going in a different direction. Whether that's brilliant leadership or ruthless betrayal depends entirely on what happens next.